Buonasera, buonasera signore Ministri, buonasera al Presidente della Fondazione Alberto Quadrio Curzio, Presidente del premio, della giuria premi, Professor Luciano Maiani. Buonasera a tutti gli intervenuti. Continua questa bellissima coincidenza fra l'inizio della stagione della nostra fondazione, del Corriere, e l'annuncio dei vincitori del Premio Balzan di quest'anno, con l'indicazione delle materie indicate per la prossima tornata del premio e un'importante poi lettura di un vincitore degli anni passati. Si è parlato a questo proposito di un'abitudine rituale consolidata, di una ricorrenza entrata a far parte delle manifestazioni civili della nostra città. Tutto vero, ma per me, per la Fondazione, c'è qualcosa di più e di diverso. Non si tratta solo della ripetizione di un rito. Si tratta, io credo, della scoperta, ogni anno più carica di significati, del valore culturale, civile, economico della ricerca e della scienza. La consegna dei premi Balzan è un'occasione per ribadire il rifiuto, per respingere l'abominio della tendenza che in questi anni ha preteso, a volte con troppo spazio, a mio parere, ha preteso di irridere al valore della scienza e della ricerca. Si è giunti talvolta in questi anni, questi 2 ultimi anni, a contrapporre scienza a libertà, quando è la scienza a indicare comportamenti, scelte e policies. Ricerca e scienza, credo, siano più che mai esse espressione e garanzia di libertà. Il rigore, il metodo scientifico sono oggi indicazioni preziose per portare avanti con la serietà dovuta gli obiettivi del PNRR, che sono strettamente intrecciati con quelli della scienza, anche se non solo con quelli della scienza. E vi è ancora, fra i molti, credo un motivo che ci fa ogni anno vedere in questo momento un esaltante, stimolante punto di partenza, non uno stanco motivo rituale, non uno stanco rituale di arrivo. La continua variabilità delle materie oggetto del premio. Il fatto che il premio riguardi sia scienze morali sia scienze dure. Esemplarmente, dicevo stasera, oltretutto testimoniata dalla presenza contemporanea, graditissima, di una ministra ricercatrice, scienziata in materie umanistiche, la ministra Cartabia, e da una ministra di scienze dure, in materie appunto più scientifiche in senso tradizionale del termine, la ministra Messa. Ecco, la continua variabilità delle materie oggetto del premio, il fatto che abbracci materie umanistiche, materie scientifiche, materie di scienze dure cosiddetto, la destinazione di parte del premio alla ricerca in un'istituzione sono fattori di diversificazione, di apertura di cui abbiamo sempre più bisogno. Siamo allora felici, anche quest'anno, di essere testimoni fedeli quanto mai decisi a fare di questi principi motivi di azione e non solo motivi di commemorazione. Grazie Presidente.
Buonasera a tutti. Un ringraziamento sentito al professor Marchetti, Presidente della Fondazione Corriere della Sera, stimato collega che anche quest'anno ci ospita e che con la sua riflessione iniziale ha tracciato nella essenzialità le caratteristiche principali del Premio Balzan. Ovviamente io sono molto lieto, anzi molto onorato, di vedere qui due colleghe, che sono la professoressa Cartabia e la professoressa Messa, che rappresentano esse stesse, oltre ai loro importantissimi ruoli istituzionali, una come Ministro della Giustizia e l'altro dell'Università e della Ricerca, rappresentano l'importanza della scienza in quei due polmoni che il professor Marchetti aveva sottolineato. La ringrazio, professor Marchetti, per averlo fatto e ringrazio, se mi consenti Piergaetano, ancora di più le due colleghe. Diritto costituzionale, diagnostica per immagini e medicina nucleare. Quindi grazie. Naturalmente introdurre una serata come questa non è compito di un amministratore, un economista. Io sono, qui vedo la dottoressa Ghirghis che è l'altro polmone della vita finanziaria della Fondazione Balzan e le presento i miei ossequi. E tuttavia vorrei fare alcune piccole considerazioni, chiamiamole organizzative. Innanzitutto la Balzan è riuscita, pur nel contesto così severo, così drammatico della pandemia, a non perdere il filo della propria continuità. Siamo riusciti a recuperare nel 21 il premio del 20 e nel 22 con due iniziative distinte a premiare il 21 e a novembre premieremo il 22. Il 21 lo abbiamo premiato a Berna, una cerimonia molto importante nel Parlamento federale, e il 22 lo celebreremo all'Accademia dei Lincei a Roma. Naturalmente riprendere il filo non significa semplicemente seguire un cronogramma, significa anche seguire una logica. E io credo che il Comitato Generale Premi abbia retto questa apparente discontinuità riflettendo continuamente su come affrontare anche la discontinuità. Ricordo che nell'anno passato fu un pneumologo a tenere la lezione, nell'anno precedente fu un biologo, immunologo. Dunque abbiamo mantenuto la continuità pur in questa drammatica situazione. Devo anche dire che la Balzan compie nel 2021, ma celebreremo nel 2022, i 60 anni. Ci sono state delle piccole discontinuità, ma 60 anni sono molti per una istituzione come questa che ha scelto una strada completamente innovativa, quella di avere 2 premi nelle scienze naturali e 2 premi nelle scienze umanistiche. Questa è una distinzione convenzionale che tuttavia è adottata in quasi tutte le accademie e tuttavia per la Balzan è una distinzione nella assoluta complementarietà. Questo è accaduto in passato anche quando i temi premiati potevano apparire distinti, questo sì, ma anche non convergenti. C'è sempre stato questo grande filone nel tempo. Recentemente la Balzan ha anche avviato premi esattamente o quasi complessivamente denominati nelle 2 fattispecie, quella umanistica e quella delle scienze naturali. Quindi sono state scelte coraggiose che comunque hanno molto caratterizzato la istituzione. Naturalmente i numeri dicono tanto e dicono poco, quindi non starò a dirvi quanti sono stati premiati, quanti sono stati anche gli importi erogati su cui si fa ricerca. E come è stato ricordato prima, il premio è diviso in 2 parti, una metà va al vincitore del premio e una metà va per progetti di ricerca con giovani, collaboratori dei premiati, ma anche altri. Do solo un numero. 500 giovani hanno collaborato dal 2001 ad oggi a progetti di ricerca e i premiati circa largo sono stati 170, quindi 500 giovani. Le nazionalità coinvolte nei progetti di ricerca si aggirano sui 40-50 paesi, numero più, numero meno. Quindi, come vedete, la mobilitazione dei giovani è stata molto forte e questo credo che sia un elemento di caratterizzazione importante della Balzan. Ultime due considerazioni, i 60 anni. Tracciare un bilancio di 60 anni non è un'operazione semplice, è un'operazione difficile, ma noi abbiamo scelto, anche in accordo ovviamente con il professor Maiani, e questa è la prima bozza del volume che presenteremo a Roma, abbiamo scelto di far parlare i vincitori dei premi, non solo delle loro materie, dei loro successi, ma anche con riferimento ai giovani che hanno lavorato con loro. Credo che questa sia stata una scelta saggia, una scelta importante e spero che questo volume sia sufficientemente eloquente. Un'ultimissima considerazione. A margine di questa tipologia così forte degli scienziati, oggi ho sentito alcune presentazioni straordinarie, direi quasi sorprendenti per la capacità di visione e di ricerca, devo dire che abbiamo svolto anche altre iniziative per creare una comunità del sapere. Una è certamente il Forum dei Premiati, dove si espongono le loro ricerche, dibattono con il pubblico ed è molto arricchente e pubblichiamo sempre gli atti del forum. Il secondo filone è quello della valorizzazione ulteriore dei giovani che collaborano. E qui abbiamo varato circa una decina di anni fa questa iniziativa Interlab, International Interdisciplinary Research Laboratory, con la collaborazione delle accademie svizzere. Questo è molto importante perché la Fondazione Balzan, pur avendo due soggetti giuridici distinti, vive da un punto di vista dell'unicità di collaborazione svizzera-italiana. E questo Interlab ci ha dato grandi soddisfazioni perché due premiati Balzan, uno nelle scienze naturali e l'altro nelle scienze umanistiche, discutono di uno stesso tema e i giovani partecipano. Quindi abbiamo cercato di mantenere viva questa comunità di grandi scienziati e di giovani che speriamo diventino grandi scienziati, alcuni lo sono già diventato per la verità, con grandi successi, per continuare questa nostra iniziativa. Rinnovo il ringraziamento a tutti, rinnovo il ringraziamento alle due colleghe, diritto costituzionale e diagnostica per immagini, e ringrazio la rappresentante del Comune di Milano che ci dà sempre il patrocinio, Vicesindaco Scavuzzo, se crede di prendere la parola.
Buonasera a tutti, buonasera a tutte. Colgo l'occasione di portare il saluto della città senza aggiungere nulla alle parole che i presidenti hanno già pronunciato, sia in quelle che sono le linee programmatiche che la Fondazione Balzan ormai da 60 anni porta avanti, sia rispetto a quello che è il coinvolgimento anche di tanti di quei settori dell'innovazione, della ricerca e dello sviluppo che evidentemente sono anche un po' il cuore pulsante della nostra città al servizio di un paese che cresce. E credo che la presenza delle due ministre oggi qui racconti di una relazione fra il governo centrale, le amministrazioni locali, ma anche le comunità locali, che evidentemente in futuro avrà bisogno ancor più di essere rafforzata. Perché le nostre città hanno attraversato tutte dei momenti molto difficili. Io credo che questa visione d'insieme fatta di esperienze capaci di valorizzare le eccellenze e il meglio che i nostri atenei, i nostri centri di ricerca possono mettere a disposizione, ecco, sia stata certamente una delle chiavi di volta anche nell'affrontare momenti complessi. Quello che abbiamo di fronte non è uno scenario semplice, anzi forse nell'ultimo anno è andato via più completandosi un quadro sempre più difficile anche da delineare. Ecco, io credo che la scienza oggi ci dica ancora molto, rispetto al metodo con il quale affrontare situazioni sempre più complesse. E quindi l'autorevolezza che abbiamo evocato, questo perseverare nel tempo, nel credere che la ricerca scientifica sia al servizio del miglioramento dell'umanità, e quel metodo scientifico che ci permette di ricostruire quel filo di Arianna che ci accompagna nelle situazioni più complesse, cercando la direzione nella quale muoverci tutti insieme senza andare a tentoni, ma riuscendo a mettere a frutto una riflessione che possa davvero costruire dei percorsi e dei processi che ci permettano di affrontare appunto la complessità che abbiamo davanti. La Fondazione Balzan da tempo è un riferimento. Evidentemente con orgoglio questo connubio con la Fondazione Corriere della Sera la rende molto vicina anche alla nostra esperienza, ma io credo che abbia consolidato questa ambizione di parlare al mondo, esattamente come la vocazione di Milano è quella di essere radicata in quella che è la sua esperienza locale, territoriale, nelle sue comunità anche scientifiche, senza mai però avere orizzonti limitati e chiusi. Ecco, io confido che anche il tempo a venire ci consegni la possibilità di mantenere questo approccio, che credo sia un approccio di cui tutti sentiamo il bisogno e che non vogliamo abbandonare, anche perché lo scenario che abbiamo di fronte, non vi nascondo, anche politico, credo che chieda alle parti migliori del nostro Paese di assumersi la responsabilità di costruire insieme al governo quello che sarà il futuro della nostra Italia. Grazie, per me è sempre un onore essere qua insieme a voi. Vi porto il saluto di tutta la città e il ringraziamento anche della città per il lavoro che avete svolto, e credo che alle nostre due ministre vada anche un grazie particolare rispetto anche a quel po' di Milano che hanno portato a Roma e a quel modo di stare nelle istituzioni che noi abbiamo tanto apprezzato. Grazie.
È arrivato dunque il momento di annunciare i premi dei vincitori del Premio Balzan 22. Il primo è il premio intitolato a Filosofia Morale. Vincitore è la professoressa Martha Nussbaum, Stati Uniti, Ernst Freund Distinguished Service Professor of Law and Ethics all'Università di Chicago, con la seguente motivazione: per il suo continuo contributo a un ampio spettro di argomenti filosofici che insieme ridefiniscono la comprensione del nostro essere etico, per la sua concezione trasformativa degli obiettivi della giustizia sociale, tanto a livello locale che a livello globale, e per la propensione a colmare il divario tra mondo accademico e società. Ci illustra la personalità della professoressa Martha Nussbaum e Stephen Mulhall, componente del Comitato Generale Premi, che invito a prendere la parola.
Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to say a few words about the work of Professor Nussbaum. Her overriding concern throughout her career has been to address the question how to lead a good life. And what's distinctive about her approach to that task is that rather than focusing on the calculation of consequences or the demands of duty and principle, she makes central the project of cultivating one's character, the project of acquiring and employing the habits and dispositions that we call the virtues as part of a flourishing human life. In this respect, she draws on her wide and deep understanding of the ancient world, both Greek and Roman, and especially the works of Aristotle, but Aristotelian ideas that are reconceived and reimagined for the era of modernity. And I just want to mention briefly three distinctive features of her body of work that flow from this Aristotelian orientation. The first is that she draws equally on literary texts and resources as much as theoretical or philosophical ones. This is because the practical wisdom possessed by the virtuous person, on her view, can't be captured in general, impersonal rules and principles. It rather involves sensitivity to particular cases, a willingness to revise and deepen one's initial understanding in the light of new experience, and a willingness to improvise in the face of unprecedented or unforeseen situations. In Professor Nussbaum's view, certain kinds of literature offer a far more adequate and illuminating embodiment of that view of practical wisdom than do philosophical treatises, even those written by Aristotle. In Professor Nussbaum's work, the novels of Dickens, Henry James, and the work of Proust and Dante are equally significant for her thinking. The second feature I wanted to mention is that Nussbaum resists a very familiar element of human self-understanding, the idea that human nature is in a state of internal conflict between rationality and the emotions. On Professor Nussbaum's approach, she believes that there's a cognitive dimension to our emotional life, which means that our emotions can be critically evaluated in terms of their appropriateness to their objects. So, for example, if you lose a loved one and you don't experience grief, then on Professor Nussbaum's view, you're failing to understand something about the situation you find yourself in. And this means in turn that leading a flourishing human life means ensuring that our emotional responsiveness is properly calibrated, not deficient or disordered. And this is one of the areas of her work where she makes very good use of work from other disciplines, in particular the area of experimental psychology. The final feature I wanted to stress was the importance of the role of the community in the project of an individual trying to lead a good life. On Professor Nussbaum's view, the virtuous person's flourishing critically depends on the availability of appropriate social resources and cultural structures. So disordered communities harm those who inhabit them. And by the same token, a community that allows virtuous people to flourish will itself flourish as a result. And it's this third element of her view that has led her to engage systematically in a practical concern with issues of social justice, both within her own political community and at a global level. With respect to the United States, she has been systematically engaged with arguments in the realms of the law and of politics around issues of poverty, deprivation, and discrimination on the basis of race or gender. And perhaps most significantly in her recent work, she's been focused on how best to conceive of the project of international development and thereby the achievement of greater justice on a planetary level. Here she's recently been arguing that increasing human welfare is not best understood as a project achieved by enhancing gross domestic product. That's not a good metric for welfare. Instead, she argues we should be using a capabilities approach. And what she means by that is the availability of substantial opportunities to choose and to act on the part of the individuals who make up the societies whose welfare we're trying to enhance. And what she has in mind is the acquisition of personal capabilities in an environment that facilitates their exercise. And as a result of this final feature of her work, Professor Nussbaum speaks not only, not even primarily in some cases, to her fellow academics, but to the wider community of which she sees herself to be a part, and on a very broad range of pressing ethical and political topics. She is therefore not only one of the most influential living moral philosophers, she is an outstanding public intellectual, and that makes her a very worthy recipient of this particular prize. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Il vincitore del Premio Balzan 2022 per etnomusicologia è Philip Bollman, Service Professor in Jewish History, Music and the Humanities all'Università di Chicago, con la seguente motivazione. Philip Bollman è un pluripremiato etnomusicologo e musicista. La sua ricca e variegata opera interroga la musica e la cultura attraversando lo spazio e il tempo nell'esperienza individuale e nell'incontro con l'altro. Tale opera, che si concentra sulla musica europea ed ebraica, affronta i temi centrali dell'etnomusicologia, come pure della ricerca musicale e più in generale degli studi umanistici, tra i quali i più rilevanti sono la musica e il nazionalismo europeo. La musica, la razza e l'incontro coloniale, la globalizzazione, le intersezioni tra musica e religione, la musica ebraica in epoca moderna, l'esecuzione di musiche ebraiche urbane improntate alla ricerca storica. Verrà illustrata l'opera del professor Bollman da Salwa El-Shawan Castelo-Branco, componente della Commissione Generale Premi, che invito a prendere la parola.
Good afternoon, everyone. It gives me great pleasure and honor to present Professor Bollman's Laudatio. He's a multifaceted and prolific work, includes research, teaching, mentoring, editorial work, translation, and performance. He has carried out field and archival research in Central and Eastern Europe, Israel, India, and among the Jewish diaspora in the United States. Bollman is an American scholar, and we have heard the position that he holds at the University of Chicago, but at the same time he has taught in Germany and in several other European countries. In Germany, he has taught at the University of Hildesheim and at the Hochschule für Musik, Theater und Medien in Hanover, where he is also an honorary professor. Through his research, teaching, translation, and consulting for academic institutions in the US and Europe, he has contributed to creating channels of communication and cooperation between ethnomusicologists and institutions on both sides of the Atlantic. Using a multidisciplinary approach in which ethnography, historical research, and music performance intersect, Bollman's publications interrogate the multiple ways in which humans use music, how nationalism contributes to the ontology of European music both in the past and in the present. And other examples of his work include the relationship between Jewish music and modernity, or the articulation between music, race, and the colonial encounter, the connections between music and religion, and between sacred musics and European modernity. The histories of folk music research and ethnomusicology have also occupied a great part of his academic production. As artistic director of the New Budapest or Orpheum Society, he also promotes the historical performance of Jewish cabaret and film music, which had vanished for some time, but now it is again revived. And I hope that in Rome we can hear some of this wonderful music that is actually performed in both German and Yiddish. Bollman has published widely in English and German. One of his important monographs, Music, Nationalism, and the Making of New Europe, in its second edition, received the Derek Allen Prize for Musicology from the British Academy. It examines music and nationalism in Europe, both in the past and the present, drawing on different genres of written and orally or orally transmitted musics, including folk, popular, religious, and art musics. Bollman draws contrasts between national and nationalist musics, highlighting their positive or negative impact on society in several parts of Europe. Dealing with a wide range of issues, musical genres, and practices, both historical and contemporary, the book argues that nationalism is the key to understanding European musics. Professor Bollman has also made a seminal contribution to the critical study of Jewish music, both past and present. His book, Jewish Music and Modernity, the final volume in a trilogy, explores the dynamic response of Jewish music to the challenges of modernity. Focusing on various border regions of Central and Eastern Europe from the 18th century Jewish Enlightenment up to the destruction of European Jewry in the Holocaust, this historical narrative examines diverse musical traditions in Jewish villages and on the stages of the modern city. Bolman argues that Jewish music is a hybrid of diverse musical genres, styles, and repertoires in different languages. He also offers a critical discussion of how assumptions about Jewish music acquire an ontology of their own, of Jewish music collecting, and of the impact of Jewishness on music and of Jewish music on modernity. Professor Bolman's intellectual leadership and his capacity to mobilize scholars, both senior and junior, to explore new issues and themes in music research and to mediate between worlds of scholarship is also evident in his extensive work as editor and co-editor of landmark volumes, monograph series, and scholarly journals. This includes, for example, Music and the Racial Imagination, co-edited with Ronald Radano. This was actually a pioneering multidisciplinary reflection on the entanglement of music and race. The Cambridge History of World Music, which is an extensive tome of over 600 pages that makes an important contribution towards the historiography of music on a global scale, and Jazz World's World Jazz, which includes a wide-ranging set of essays on jazz in global modernity. The latter two volumes also received prestigious awards, respectively the Bruno Nettle Prize from the Society for Ethnomusicology and the Ruth Soley Award from the American Musicological Society. Professor Bolman's scholarly contribution also extends to his work as curator and translator into English of Johann Gottfried Herder's writings on music and nationalism, thereby making his fundamental work accessible to contemporary readers. For his seminal contribution to ethnomusicology and music research more broadly, and for his work on music and European nationalism, Jewish music and modernity, globalization, music and race, Philip Bolman deserves the Balzan Prize in Ethnomusicology. Thank you.
Passiamo adesso ai premi per le scienze naturali. Il premio Balzan 2022 per biomateriali per la nanomedicina e l'ingegneria dei tessuti è stato assegnato a Robert Langer, David Koch Institute Professor all'Istituto MIT di Boston, con la seguente motivazione: per aver aperto la strada alla ricerca sui biopolimeri e biomateriali e la loro sintesi, e per aver sviluppato il campo della nanomedicina, compresi i progressi relativi ai vaccini mRNA e all'ingegneria dei tessuti. Le scoperte rivoluzionarie di Langer hanno aperto la strada a innovazioni nel rilascio controllato di macromolecole con numerose applicazioni mediche. Maria Strømme, componente del Comitato Generale dei Premi, presenterà il profilo del premiato. Prego.
So, thank you. It is an honor to present to you this year's Balzan Prize winner in the field of biomaterials for nanomedicine and tissue engineering, Dr. Robert Langer. But before I start to describe his achievements in some detail, I want to share with you some quite spectacular facts. Dr. Langer is actually the most highly cited person in the field of engineering and chemistry in our entire history. And he's also the third most cited researcher in any field at all times. Langer is the author of more than 1,500 papers, where over 200 are published in Nature, Science, and the Proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences. And he's the inventor behind more than 1,500 patents in medicine, and that is the highest number in history for any person in medicine. So it's a quite spectacular person. Langer's research is in the field of material science with the objective of developing new solutions for drug delivery and regenerative medicine. And he was the first scientist to demonstrate how large biomolecules, including nucleic acids, could be embedded into polymers and other materials and thereafter be released slowly over time in the human body. And this is a technology that has benefited more than 2 billion people in the world. And his work has been translated for wide use. His patents have been licensed to over 300 companies, and he has also started 45 companies. And you all know one of the companies he has started, that is Moderna, where his technology for drug delivery ensured stable provision of mRNA for a completely new class of vaccines. I guess many of you have benefited from his discoveries. Now to some more details of his work. Robert Langer was the first to uncover the principles enabling the use of polymers for delivery of a wide range of molecules, including some with a molecular weight of several millions. Only those of you who are chemists can understand what that means. But his discovery has broadly and profoundly affected medical treatments, and almost all of us are using controlled release medications based on his work, and their annual sales are now measured in billions of dollars. And just to give you some historic background, biopolymers and biomaterials have played a significant role in the effective delivery and use of biological compounds. Before Langer's inventions, scientists actually used off-the-shelf materials to address a biological or medical problem, even though the materials were not designed for that use. For example, the same material used in a woman's girdle was used in artificial hearts because of the mechanical properties of this material. And materials used to stuff mattresses were also used for breast implants. So Langer, he went ahead and proposed a new approach which provided the first rational framework for the design of biomaterials and biopolymers for specific use. Langer, together with his co-worker Joseph Vacanti, they were the first to develop synthetic polymer systems to allow cells to form specific tissue structure, and thereby they established the field of tissue engineering. And this actually led to the design of new artificial skin that is now used for patients with burns and skin ulcers, replacement cartilage, bones, corneas, blood vessels, and spinal cords have all been created in humans using this approach, which eventually may lead to the creation of virtually any tissue or organ in humans or on chips, which is very good for research. Langer, he also discovered ways to use small molecules delivered by gels that greatly enhance the growth of certain stem cells. And molecules of this type are now being tested clinically to restore hearing loss. Together with the late Judah Folkman, Langer was the first to develop really small particles to protect and deliver nucleic acid, even though it was deemed impossible at the time. And their approach, which of course have been improved by others, is today the basis for all mRNA vaccines. Langer developed the first technologies for the delivery of large molecular weight molecules, as I said previously, and these discoveries, they've actually led to numerous medical and non-medical products, including treatments for cancer, for heart diseases, and for diabetes. And lastly, Langer's discoveries have made it possible to overcome some critical limitations in many potential new drugs that are on the way out to us as patients, those including something called siRNA, or gene editing approach, and as I mentioned previously, mRNA, by facilitating their delivery to specific human tissue. And a portrait in the journal Nature, which is like the rock star journal for us scientists, in 2009, a portrait in Nature entitled Being Bob Langer actually stated that Robert Langer founded the field of controlled release drug delivery and tissue engineering. So he is absolutely a very worthy Balzan Prize winner. Thank you.
The second prize in natural sciences for 2022 is dedicated to glaciazione e dinamica delle calotte polari ed è stato assegnato al gruppo di lavoro formato da Dorth et al. Jensen, William Investigator, Physics of Ice, Climate and Earth Niels Bohr Institute, Università di Copenaghen, e Canada Excellent Research Chair, Center for Earth Observation Science, e ad Hans Erlemans, professore emerito all'Università di Utrecht, dal 2018 affiliato con l'Accademia Engladina. La motivazione per i fondamentali e pionieristici contributi congiunti e complementari alla dinamica della glaciazione e delle calotte polari e per la portata che hanno avuto sulla comprensione del cambiamento climatico e dei suoi meccanismi, che hanno aperto la strada a proiezioni più attendibili del comportamento della calotta polare e dei relativi cambiamenti del livello del mare. Illustrerà i lavori di Dal Jensen e Erlemans il professor Sierd Cloetingh, membro del Comitato Generale Premi. Prego.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure for me to present today the two prize winners for a joint prize in glaciation and ice sheet dynamics. The evolution of ice sheets is of crucial impact for the Earth system at large. This applies in the first place to sea level change, but also to climate. And it is here where both researchers have made fundamental contributions over quite a few decades. You see here two examples of two very high impact joint papers which appeared in Science and Nature. Examples where you see the involvement of a large community. They really have been able to build a community in a field which is today probably even more relevant than when they started this research. Dorthe has been a key person in getting ice core drilling off the ground. She made pioneering contributions to, first of all, to get it done, but second of all, to analyze the data, to extract the climates of the past. In doing so, she made a large number of pioneering scientific contributions listed here. A really breakthrough in this context has been her capability to extract temperature directly from the ice cores. And when we speak about ice core drilling, you must think about remote areas such as Greenland and the Antarctica, and you must think about drilling under very harsh conditions to depths of a few kilometers. What is quite remarkable is also her role as a global leader in leading, organizing and integrating multinational teams. This requires really a large-scale approach and very complex fieldwork on top of the Greenland ice sheets. And what is also very, very important, of course, is the long-term vision. And in this context of community building, the Carthouse summer schools that she initiated quite a while ago has been vital. That has really moved glaciology and ice sheet dynamic research to the forefront. And I'm very pleased that we have here today one of the top researchers who has lectured here in the Carthouse Summer School, Professor Kurt Lambeck, Balzan Prize recipient in 2012. And you see him lecturing to a group of young researchers. And you see on the next slide the impact. A very enthusiastic group of young researchers. I think you will conclude with me that this is really a fairly happy crowd. And what is remarkable, that also here she teamed up very well with Hans Oerlemans, the other prize winner. You see them sitting here with Dorte here in the middle, and the man with the cap on the right-hand side for you, that is Hans Oerlemans. And again, these schools have made the difference. And what is also important, of course, is the notion that both have been at the forefront right from the beginning. And this is also applying to Hans Oerlemans. You can see 1978, already a keynote paper on the evolution of climate in the Earth system, linked to the evolution of the ice caps. More than 40 years ago, he published this landmark paper in Nature. For the first time, a self-consistent model explaining the main features of the Antarctic ice sheet. A real breakthrough. Very original and quite a long time in advance of other researchers. Another landmark contribution was his science paper extracting a climate signal from glacial records. And again, well in advance of the community at large, laying the foundations for a lot of subsequent work. Highly original and consistently moving the field to the forefront. You see him in the field, and again, these are pretty harsh conditions. You have seen a picture from Dorte Dahl Jensen, also on the ice cap. You see here Hans in the glacial domain. But apart from that, he is also operating in other settings as an ambassador of the field of glaciology, polar research and ice sheet dynamics. And you see him here discussing polar science with the Queen of the Netherlands, Her Majesty Maxima. And it's very clear, of course, that he has a message. And the same applies to Dorte Dahl Jensen. These people have a message which is important to take notice of. And that has impact. The foundation of Glacier Alive by Hans Oerlemans, quite recently, is another example of the community service that he and Dorte are doing to convey the results of their frontier research to society at large. And again, this is quite important in view of the issues that are facing today humankind. So let me conclude by stating that it's very evident that we have here a dream team of prize winners, and that they together are very worthy recipients of our Balzan Prize. Thanks for your attention.
As a conclusion of the exposition of the prizes 2022, I would like to recall that also this year, as decided by the Council of the International Foundation Balzan Premio, half of the amount of the 4 prizes that we have just announced will be utilized by the Balzan laureates to realize research projects with young researchers and students. We can now go to the matters that will be considered in the Balzan Prize 2023. I want to recall an element that has been discussed already, the importance of interdisciplinary research. to underline that, already a few years ago, we have decided to assign once every 2 years one prize which is made of 2 components, one natural sciences and one scientific sciences and humanistic sciences. And this year, for the 2023, we have proposed a joint prize with a common title, Evoluzione umana. Il sottotitolo scientifico è DNA antico ed evoluzione umana, e il sottotitolo umanistico è Paleoantropologia. Per quanto riguarda gli altri 2 premi, uno umanistico e uno scientifico, i premi saranno assegnati per letteratura mondiale, per il premio umanistico, e immagini ad alta risoluzione dagli oggetti planetari a quelli cosmici per il premio scientifico. Naturalmente anche nel 2023 i premi Balzan del valore di 750.000 franchi svizzeri ciascuno saranno suddivisi in 2 parti, metà per i premiati e metà per una ricerca promossa dai vincitori del premio che coinvolga giovani ricercatori e studenti. Grazie della vostra attenzione. Questo conclude la discussione dei premi e passiamo adesso alla seconda parte del programma, che è un discorso di un laureato Balzan degli anni passati, Martinez Alayer, è molto ben conosciuto per aver immaginato il concetto di giustizia ambientale e illustrerà appunto il progetto EJ Atlas, l'Atlante di Environmental Justice, per la nostra attenzione. Invito allora Martinez Alayer, tu di salire sul palco e gli do la parola. Prego.
Sono molto lieto di poter presentare il collega Joan Martinez Alayer, Premio Balzan 2020, e faccio questo non in quanto Presidente della Fondazione Premio, in quanto collega delle scienze dell'economia politica e della politica economica. Joan è stato un vero pioniere in questo campo, un pioniere coraggioso, molto coraggioso, e un pioniere, come tutti o quasi tutti i pionieri, lungimirante. Il suo curriculum è un curriculum straordinario. Per dare un riferimento specifico, credo che si possa definire il fondatore della Ecological Economics, anche se, come lui sa, io preferisco parlare della Ecological Political Economy, ma questo è una nuance oggetto di discussione tra di noi. Dal punto di vista della sua impostazione, egli ha avuto l'approccio tipico delle scienze sociali e delle scienze umane, ma con specifici riferimenti anche alle scienze naturali, e come tale si è proprio collocato in quella fascia della interdisciplinarietà che, pur avendo una prevalenza nelle scienze sociali, economiche ed umane, tuttavia teneva adeguatamente in conto le scienze naturali. Agricoltura, forestazione, tutte quelle tematiche che in un contesto di scarsità delle risorse in cui tuttora viviamo, malgrado l'illusione passata che la scarsità non ci fosse più, e su questo io mi sento di condividere pienamente il mainstream di una minoranza, perché noi siamo una minoranza, siamo un mainstream di una minoranza, è un paradosso ma è così, alla quale anch'io ho dedicato, non nel contesto dell'ambientale ma anche nel contesto della scarsità delle risorse, molti dei miei studi. È stato professore in varie università, è professore emerito all'Università di Barcellona, Dipartimento di Economia e Storia del pensiero economico, anche tutte e due, e quindi è certamente una personalità molto, molto importante di questo concetto. Farei due riferimenti istituzionali su cui spero lui possa fare qualche accenno, che sono gli obiettivi di sviluppo sostenibile delle Nazioni Unite e forse anche il Next Generation EU dell'Unione Europea. Mi piacerebbe forse, se ci fosse un minimo di dibattito, parlare di questo. In conclusione, la lezione che citerò oggi riguarda il tema di EJ Atlas, Ecological Justice Atlas, che è un'altra sua iniziativa veramente importante. The Making of World Movement for Environmental Justice, che è il tema appunto anche questo fortemente avveniristico e innovativo al quale lui dedica adesso la sua attenzione. Ultima annotazione: ha avuto il premio Leontief, che per gli strutturalisti come siamo noi è un premio molto importante nel nome di un grande economista scienziato. Scusate la mia probabilmente come dire, estesa presentazione, ma è un'occasione importante anche per gli economisti politici e quindi ringrazio della pazienza e, se il Presidente consente, do la parola al collega Martinez Alies.
Grazie. Io parlerò in inglese, inglese un poco iberico. E poi questo è this is titled Environmental Justice Atlas, and I'll explain this. And the subtitle is something, well, this is going to be a book. The book is not yet published, but the making of world movements. I have been thinking whether it's movement or movements in the plural. So these things are still open. It would be very nice to have time for a discussion at the end. And also I remember to discuss the Sustainable Development Goals. And here, since we are in a Balzan Prize context, and I got the Balzan Prize 2 years ago, and now I have been here listening to the prizes, and I know that there are deliberations in which I have not been active about which prizes or which topics you could choose for the next years, 24, 25, 26. So I wanted to start with this thing, because this is what I do. I bring together ecological economics, political ecology, some of environmental history, and of course in ecological economics, one part of it is the study of the metabolism of the human, of the economy, of the human society and economy, meaning the flows of energy and materials. These are words, metabolism, from about 1840, no, Stoffwechsel in German at the beginning. And this, but of course the human societies have metabolism. And this is part, well, this is part of different disciplines, but one is ecological economics. So perhaps in due course we can have prizes on what we could call also the environmental social sciences, isn't it? And there are universities which already have department of environmental social sciences. So with this background, or this background, one background is that what the future can have for us. I'll start saying this, that the world in ecological economics, we start quite often with this statement: the world economy is not circular, it is entropic, and we quote Georgescu Reagan's book of 1971, like 51 years ago. He was not the first one. It was already Frederick Soddy in Oxford, for instance, and other precursors of this idea, because it's quite obvious that an economy based on burning coal, oil and gas, or also biomass, is entropic in the sense that you cannot burn anything twice, isn't it, to put it very shortly. This was the meaning of saying that the economy is not circular, whatever the fashion now is to say that we're moving to a circular economy is not true, as the second statement shows. If in the economy of the world, every year, more or less, by chance, is about 100 gigatons of materials entering the economy. Well, this year will be a little bit more, and next year a little bit more as things are moving. But in the last 2-3 years with the pandemic and so on, this was 100, is an easy number to remember, and of this only less than 10 gigatons, gigatons are billion tons, are recycled. All the rest are, well, energy carriers, coal and gas and oil, but also other materials which at the end, as we all know, are not recycled. For instance, all the sand and gravel for the cement industry, this goes into buildings, might be recycled in about 100 years, isn't it? But it's not very likely that it will be. And because of this, well, that's my very structured explanation. Because of this, many environmental conflicts arise in the world, both at the commodity extraction frontiers, but also waste disposal frontiers. And one of the conflicts at the waste disposal frontiers is climate change. And there is the killing curve, which many of you will know. I don't know whether El Corriere della Sera has ever printed this, but probably not 50 years ago, but perhaps in the last few years, which is how the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is increasing, and it will reach, without any doubt, I think, 450 parts per million in the next 20 or 30 years. Not in my lifetime, but in the lifetime of the people younger in the audience. And the ups and downs, you know, depends on the winter or the summer. But this is the trend. And when I started the first lecture, if I remember already, in 1992, because I was an economist and an economic historian, but then I became a lapsed economist and became more interested in these issues, in ecological economics. And this was in 92, the year of the Rio conference. And as you can see, in 1992, we were at 360 parts per million. So it's going quite fast. So I prefer to show this than to talk about 1.5 degrees and so on, because we don't know exactly, and depends where in the world, isn't it? But on this, we all agree that this is, well, it was a very good idea to send killing to Mauna Loa and Hawaii in the late 50s to start these measurements, and it could be measured also in Milan, but it's not. This is the standard curve that we all know. And because of this, you see, what I'm doing is looking at the physical part and then trying to explain the social or historical part in all this. Because of this, there are environmental movements. Some people know the recent environmental movements from school children in Sweden and so on, but I think they are much older, these environmental movements, both against commodity extraction, but also because of waste disposal. There has been a debate in environmental sociology or in political science, actually, or political ecology, on whether environmentalism is something more from the middle class, from the rich, or whether it's something from everybody. And with Ram Gua, some years ago, we published a book called Varieties of Environmentalists in '97, based on our experiences in India, in his case, and Latin America in my case. And then I published this book about 20 years ago on the environmentalists of the poor. I would call it today the environmentalists of the poor and the indigenous, isn't it? Because there are so many experiences. All these links with the environmental justice movement in the US, which grew already in the 80s, against what they called, because it was coming from the civil rights movement, they called it the movement against environmental racism. Here we are using environmental justice not as philosophers would do, say, no, that we heard something before about Martin Nussbaum, although Martin Nussbaum would not very far from this kind of, he would be interested in this, but not as in a philosophical sense, what is the proper way of being just towards other generations or other animals or towards poor people. We use in the sociological sense, observing that there are movements, environmental movements, local movements, which sometimes they don't call themselves environmental, but they are environmental, the contents of the movements, and this is more a sociological or political observation. And this observation, I see my book is already 20 years old, this one, and this started about 10 years ago, that we got some European projects to start doing a real bit crazy idea. It was not my idea, it was the idea of somebody younger, of doing an atlas, an inventory, as historians would do, an inventory, but not on paper, but in the web, of all these, now there are nearly 4,000 cases of EDCs, means ecological distribution conflicts, and they are coded by color. I'll explain it later. And this is both a tool for research on political ecology, or what we call comparative or even statistical political ecology, and also is produced with, sometimes, not always, with local movements. We give information, and we hope it helps them to make visible many of these conflicts. Some are very historical, but some are very, very recent. And this, for instance, in Italy, there must be like 30 or 40 conflicts in the map, which quite often come from what they call in Italy comitati, you know, the local movements complaining in many places, whether it's tough in one place or other places. So now coming back a little bit more theoretical points, all this starts from the view that the human economy should not be studied separated from the environment, as has been for so long, since Adam Smith onwards or before, or rather separated, not totally separated. And on the contrary, we should look at the economy, describe, if you want, with economic language, like the production, the GDP, or whatever, statistical, economic statistics, but also we should look at it with a non-equivalent description of the social metabolism, counting the energy and the materials and the very different commodities. In Central Europe and also in Italy, about 100 or 150 years ago, there was a science in Germany called Warenkunde. And in Italy, they translated this as merceologia. And this existed in the schools of economics or in the schools of commerce, isn't it? The study of mercy, of commodities. This went out with the science of economics because all the commodities are more or less the same. They are measured in quantities and in money, but doesn't matter the chemistry of the commodities, isn't it? But in Warenkunde, in the science of commodities, this is very important. Whether it's lithium, or it's copper, or it's cobalt, or it's whatever it is, or it is biomass, is very different. So this is the metabolism. And then there are these conflicts I already explained, and another theoretical or empirical finding, but which links with very old theories, in fact coming from Aristotle, of the difference between chrematistics and oikonomia, or put expresses like this, is that there are very plural valuation languages. Plural valuation. In these conflicts, we see that the people complaining, quite often they might say, we want economic compensation, particularly at the end of the conflict. If they lose, they say, I'll give us some money. But probably, or sometimes at least at the beginning, they would say the water is sacred, or the land is sacred, or we have indigenous territorial rights, or the ecology of the place is very important. All these values are not, in my view, commensurable, cannot be translated into a single unit, isn't it? Although economists like to do this, to put money values to everything. So there is a more technical terms, there is a debate between people doing cost-benefit analysis in money terms and people doing multi-criteria analysis, so we would say in technical terms. But multi-criteria analysis is too technical for what happens in reality, in which people really complain and fight and get killed sometimes, quite often, actually, like about 15% of the cases we have, there have been some people killed in this kind debates, let them call them. So the economic, that's why we became ecological economists. There is an incapacity of the economic reasoning to take into account the damage. There was a proto-ecological economist called Carl Wilhelm Kapp who said externalities are not market failures, externalities are cost-shifting successes, which is a bit cynical as a phrase, but is more or less more accurate for reality. There is an excessive focus on GDP, including in the Sustainable Development Goals, actually, which number 8 says that the economy should grow 3 or 4 or 5%, means the GDP, and that this would be sustainable by some kind of miraculous, I don't know what kind of, well, dematerialization is what is expected and so on. But I think it's very imprudent of the Sustainable Development Goals to put this. One of the goals, number 8, says this: the economy of the world has to increase in the poor countries 7% per year, and in the rich countries perhaps 3% per year. Doesn't say for how long. But this I am in favor of the Sustainable Development Goals, except for number 8. And also in this question of the terminology, I've already mentioned CAP, but when we talk both in mainstream economics, or whether we talk about gross investment more than accumulation of capital, or in Marxist economics about accumulation of capital, well, I could say that this, one can understand what they mean or we mean, but it's quite often equivalent to say more dissipation of energy and materials and increased emission of carbon dioxide and loss of biodiversity. It will be very rare so far still that in a course of introductory economics, any professor of economics would start the course saying this, isn't it? Think that what we're going to study is how the economy grows and gross investment, net investment, and so on. But we're going to call this dissipation of energy because they'll say, well, it's a mistake. You have to go to physics or to environmental sciences. But reality is not like this. Reality is exactly mainstream economics together with this kind of ecological view. This is the reality. And therefore, all this, which I'm explaining here, links a little bit with the debate, which is strong, in Europe at least, on the growth or prosperity without growth, as Jackson calls it, or the growth, as we call it more in Barcelona, with Arthur Scaris, or Jason Hickel, who is a young really star who has moved to Barcelona. And I think that the post-growth, or in German they would call it post-Wachstum, because the translation doesn't sound well, degrowth. All this is the same, these names for the same idea, is a movement of activists and intellectuals, which is quite strong. In fact, I could quote myself here from my articles, well, this comes from Georgescu Reagan, isn't it? From the report to the Club of Rome of the Meadows, and there is a continuity in this kind of thinking. With some practice, perhaps, in some places in Europe. But I call it rather solipsistic because I think it's too much from the north. People look at the south in terms of what they think, whether they say sumac causa in Quechua. But it's not what people say. I think what is important is what people do. And what people do in the south or in the north also, for instance, well, I don't want to put examples, but there are examples also in Germany, for instance, the Ende Gelände movement against coal mining near Berlin and near Köln. Ende Gelände, which is a movement for leaving the coal underground, isn't it? For climate change reason in that case, not because of local reasons. So there is environmental justice in the world and mainly in the south, in a way, as I see it, an ally, but it's stronger than this growing movement of degrowth in the north, which really not growing so much, but it exists. It exists. Even President Macron recently, in August, in a speech to the Council of Ministers, I don't know whether you read, he said, c'est la fin de l'abondance. No? It's the end of abundance, taken probably from Pierre Charbonnier's book, which is called Abundance and Liberty, and making this. How are we going to have liberty if there is not this promise of abundance, which we cannot have anymore, according to some people of this kind of school? So these environmentalists of the people, of the poor, of the indigenous from the south, is an ally of this movement, or the other way around, I would say. It's more important, in my view, this wide movement from the south, or from the north, on environmental justice. This links also with what has been said very briefly before about capabilities, in the sense that if we think that poverty is multidimensional to come many years ago to the early Amartya Sen and so on, it's true. Poverty is multidimensional, and we see this in the cases that we collect in the others, because if any firm goes to a place to do, for instance, mining of whatever, of copper mining, for instance, whether it's Chinese or Canadian, what they do would be a big hole, isn't it? And they would pollute the water even if they don't want to, and they will deprive the people, the local people, of the land and of the clean water, isn't it? If it is gold mining, they will take 1 gram of gold for every ton of earth which they are moving, and they will pollute the water with cyanide or perhaps mercury also. So for the local people, even if they get money in the form of wages or an indemnity perhaps, compensation, they have lost their capability, if I can use the word, for making a happy life, or a life as they had before, which was using the local resources of land and water. So this idea that poverty cannot be measured in money terms, which is so common today, that it's not a question of $2 per day or $3 per day, links with this idea of multidimensional environmental conflicts. And the protagonists, who are the protagonists? Because we call about a movement has to have participants, isn't it? And well, in the movement for environmental justice, across all these conflicts that we have in the others, which is a classification as we could have another nuclear energy, mineral roles, waste management. You can see the 10 main categories, and then we have many subcategories. Then there is an overlap. There are, of course, environmental justice organizations active in these things, or local neighbors, local peasants. But also there are sometimes feminist movements, anti-colonial movements. So I'm going to show now this, counting in the others with 3,600 entries. According to the data sheets that we have filled, not myself, it takes about 1 week to fill one of these data sheets, or 3 or 4 days. So there are many hours or many years of work, perhaps 30 years of work in building up the others. And then we can do some statistics, and this would be one. Who are the participants? Well, this is something that for people doing social movement theory is of interest, and also for former Marxists, if they want to see what is the class content of this kind of movements, or sociologists. You know? Anybody could say, who are the protagonists of this kind of movements? Well, to tell the truth, I am not quite sure, but if anybody knows, it's us who have made the others with such a large sample of conflicts, isn't it? And what appear is local, what we call local environmental justice organizations, like the Comitati in Italy, or could be normal citizens or communities, farmers or peasants, or should have written peasants, modern farmers, but also local scientists intervene quite often when there is a debate about the toxic implications of the project, for instance, or who are the indigenous communities, indigenous people which are about 5% in the world, according to the sort of UN statistics. Only 5% of people in the world belong to indigenous groups with their own language and so on. In Europe would be only the Samis, so few people more. But in the others, it's not 5%. In 40% of the cases, we have indigenous people participating. So we can go through this and make your own conclusions about who are the protagonists of these movements for environmental justice. And I could show similar things about what kind of mobilization they have, what are the, as they call, sociologists would call this, the repertoires of contention, also how many of these cases end with success or with failure for the people who complain. I already mentioned how often people are killed, and so on. And we have now several articles, new articles published, and one is about women environmental defenders, specifically on women environmental defenders, and how the forms they complain. There are also religious groups, and we can do now, I could do a sort of map with the others, showing where they are, and they are in Latin America, from liberation theology, or Buddhists, no? Not that all Buddhists are environmentalists or even nice people politically, but it's true that in Tibet or in Southeast Asia, Buddhist lamas take leadership quite often, from times. So we could, apart from doing the social movement contributions to social movement theory, and in what I am writing now, I compare this quite often with feminism, not because I cannot impersonate a feminist or be an expert on feminism, but I have seen the feminist movement grow, as we all have, and the feminist movement has been growing without a Politburo and without a central committee, and there are women complaining everywhere in the world about different claims and grievances, but quite similar, and they know each other. So there is Lucy Delap from Cambridge, who has written a good book recently of about 400 pages with this, and there are a lot of other literature. So this is the kind of social movements without leaders, or with sort of passing leaders, and without this idea of forming one single movement. And one could also go to history and read A.P. Thompson on the making of the English working class, which I remember reading a long time ago, having been surprised that the English working class was born in Methodist churches in Wales, which was something for somebody from Barcelona was really very strange. Because in Barcelona, the working class organized by anarchists, isn't it, in the 19th century? And in Italy, more or less the same. So there is a lot of empirical work that one can do in studying the origin of these social movements. And as Charles Tilly wrote some years ago, 20 years ago, a social movement does not mean so much an organization, but a cluster of performances, of events and episodes. And in the others, we see some which are quite similar in different places. Sometimes they know each other, or they get to know each other. And so tomorrow in the sessions we will show the Arctic and the conflicts around the Arctic by indigenous people. And we can discuss whether they get together, which is very difficult to get together from Russia to Canada or to Finland. Politically difficult and geographically. So this is what. If there is a movement, it would have also an iconography, and it would have music, isn't it? It would have a lot of music. For instance, I put here cultural expressions in different languages. For example, in Tamil Nadu, in Embor Creek, just north of Chennai, there is protest because they have put about 3 or 4 big coal-fired power plants, and they have destroyed the fishing grounds and also the mangroves, and there were people there. This in Chennai, of course, there are mangroves, there would be mangroves. This has been more or less destroyed. And there is a song quite more or less popular, sung in Tamil by T.M. Krishna, who is a Carnatic singer who sings normally songs which have, I don't know, 3,000 years old perhaps, or 4,000 years old, because Tamil is a very old language, but he's now moved into singing environmental songs, sometimes in the form of rap or some kind of more contemporary music with younger people, but this is not. If you look for this Poramboke song, it's sung in solemn Carnatic way and with other people and music. And then he claims also that Poramboke, which I don't know exactly how to pronounce, in Tamil really means the commons. Although people use Poramboke to say that somebody is a good for nothing, they say is a Poramboke, or something that anybody can use is a Poramboke. Said no, in real Tamil, and he sings as a kind of, well, as a Brahmin singing Carnatic song. So he's somebody. He's about 40 years old, and I recommend this. For a minute, I thought I would put the song, but I think you can try to find it. Or you have many photos and banners and songs, and any movement produces banners and songs and demonstrations and so on. I don't know whether this proves the existence of the movement, but at least it makes it plausible to think that these movements exist. And this one, which is from Cajamarca in Peru, this lady, she's saying water is worth more than gold, and she most probably in her educational mind she remembers Pizarro and Atahualpa because it was in Cajamarca in Peru where these episodes of Western civilization took place. And it says water is worth more. Sometimes this is a slogan used in Latin America quite often, the same slogan, invented in many places by we don't know by whom. And sometimes a bit pedantically, I say, well, this is not quite what she means. She doesn't mean that water, 1 liter of water is worth more than 1 kilogram of gold in money terms. It's absurd to say this. She means that we need, there are different standards of value, and that water is valued in the standards of value of livelihood, or perhaps sacredness, livelihood in this case, and is not commensurable or strongly comparable with money values, isn't it? So this issue of comparability, commensurability, and so on, which is really well developed by Otto Neurath and by other people in analytical philosophy, is very useful for the kind of thing that we look at. But the best thing is that this kind of photographs and this kind of slogans, spontaneous slogans. So this is the end. I think that political theory, and here I am using what I know and what I have studied myself, but also I already mentioned Pierre Charbonnier's book, and he puts it very clearly. The book is translated into several languages now. It's called Abondance et Liberté, and he's a political philosopher, and he says that political theory did not take environmental issues as crucial concern, although all political philosophies from Grotius and Locke, and then the economists, Adam Smith I mentioned, and Marx and Ricardo, all talk about the land, and they talk at the beginning at least about the colonies and the convenient idea of having slaves for their own countries. So they were not unaware of the physical realities, no? But they more or less put them aside to talk more, well, you know what they talked about, in some cases about the virtue of being an owner of the land, like Locke, and then meliorating the land. In the case of Adam Smith, the market and the division of labor. In the case of Marx, you know, all of them were, well, not all of them, but many of them, some were repeating the same ideas, knew about the physical part of the economy. How could they not know about it? But didn't put this in the central stage. When one goes to the 20th century, when the debate about climate change could have started, if not earlier, at least in 1886, isn't it? With the articles by Svante Arrhenius in Sweden and other people. So this is known now for 120 years scientifically. This did not become a matter of politics, well, depending how you measure this. But Budiko was mentioned in a previous slide. Budiko was a Soviet expert on climate change. And from the 60s and 70s, he was saying, there's going to be climate change, but it's good because we can cultivate in Siberia, more or less. But so this was known. That's the point I'm making. This was known. But until the IPCC and the 80s, and then Rio, and even now, it's very well known, but nothing is being done, to tell the truth, isn't it? Nothing is done in as effective political. Is not the main thing. I was asking somebody how often they mention climate change now in the Italian electoral campaign. So not very often, I think. But this perhaps is going to change, or at least it should change. And one way that this should change is by, well, through what we do here, people like us in this room. I mean, through universities or research institutions, pushing the place that the environmental social sciences had, because there are very important questions here. Apart from looking at this movement around the world, one question is whether the freedom of the markets and political freedoms went together or go together or not. Is there going to be a kind of authoritarian environmentalist? The relation of economic growth to democracy. Well, does democracy need economic growth? I was brought up, for my disgrace, in Franco's Spain for the first 20 years of my life. And at the end of Franco, people were saying, once we reached, I think it was $1,000 per capita, well, it coincided more or less that he died then, at the end. But I mean, no relation. But the question is, more economic growth provokes more democracy? Well, it's not so clear, isn't it? And is there going to be economic growth in the common sense of the world? In China, for instance, where there are 4 billion tons of coal extraction per year, and so on. And I put that last line yesterday when I was preparing this, that, well, as many of you, perhaps I feel, although I am a sort of optimistic type, and I don't know why, but I mean, that all these movements are going to change the world, feminism and the environmental movement and so on. After the start of the Ukraine war, I think that perhaps a new age of empire, to use Hobsbawm's title in one of the books, as Europe before 1918, isn't it? They were killing each other, and nobody understood why they should kill each other, but they kill each other with great enthusiasm in the First World War. So are we moving into an age of empire where climate change is going to be just forgotten for a few years, decisive years, and biodiversity, or where are we moving, isn't it? Well, I don't know. It's not a science. It's a different kind of discussion. But of course, it's relevant what is going on. One good, between commas, one useful thing that has come from the Ukraine war or invasion is that people now say, gas is very important. Well, yeah, gas was very important 6 months ago also. And gas comes from the Yamal Peninsula. Yamal Peninsula, what this might be? Well, this is on the top of Siberia. And who is doing the Nord Stream and so on? The Total company from France. And you can do a little bit of iconography of Patrick Pouyanné, the CEO of Total, with Macron at one arm and Putin at the other arm just 2 or 3 years ago. So the world is changing, but I'm not sure for the right direction. Thank you.
Grazie, professor Martinez-Salier. La sua relazione sarà oggetto anche di discussione domani in Interlab, dove saranno relatori sul tema environment il professor Martinez-Salier e la professoressa Condorosi. Credo che sarà un dibattito molto interessante perché ci saranno posizioni di consenso, posizioni di dissenso, posizioni problematiche, ma la scienza è fatta di discussione e quindi certamente il professor Martinez Aglier con la professoressa Condorosi darà risposte adeguate, non necessariamente convincenti, ma adeguate alle domande. Domani è il 10° anniversario di Interlab, ne abbiamo fatti 10, non voglio raccontarvi la storia, ma credo che sia un anniversario importante. Ne parleremo a Roma il mese di novembre e per quanto mi riguarda ringrazio tutti e credo che si possa considerare conclusa la nostra riunione con un rinnovato ringraziamento alla Fondazione Corriere della Sera, alle nostre 2 colleghe che hanno anche ruoli istituzionali, ma innanzitutto sono colleghe, alla dottoressa Girgis e a tutti voi. Grazie e arrivederci.